left off, and I'm glad to see most everybody back. We got a few more wandering in still, but glad to see everybody back. And again, I'm just struck by the providence in Pastor Robbins speaking this morning on creation and how closely it ties with some of the things that we touched on last night, things that apply in today's lecture and the coming lectures as well. There's a lot of things that I had wanted to say. I'm going to put a timer on here so I can kind of keep up with my time. There were some things that I had wanted to say that I can't multitask. My wife knows that quite well. That fit very well with all this economic talk. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of overlap with what will be coming later as we hear from Mr. Leggett's about the stewardship of creation. Well, today we're going to start and kind of lay some more foundational work, some more groundwork for how we talk and how we think about economics. And one of the things that we do in economics, as with as a lot of other areas, is we build models. We use models to understand things. There's got to be more to life than just being really, 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 really good looking. That's not the kind of models we're talking about, okay? That's not the kind of models we're talking about. No, models are used to help explain concepts and to boil them down to simpler terms. And common economic models that we will talk about this morning, supply and demand curves. Some of y'all know about that. Some of y'all have heard about that. You see people doing this all the time, supply, demand, all this kind of stuff. And we're trying to boil down some fairly complicated concepts into simpler terms just to make it easier to get the foundational core principles. And one of the things that we'll do with that is we'll reference Occam's razor. William of Occam, 1287 to 1347. He was a priest. And this is a great live-action photo of him teaching, preaching at the time. I think it was a little before digital photography. But his concept of, one of the things, his contributions was that, generally speaking, the simplest idea or the simplest explanation for a phenomenon is most likely the correct one. If you have to go through lots of gyrations to come up with an explanation for something, that's probably not it. And Pastor Robbins touched on that, didn't he, this morning, in talking about our reading of Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation account. The simplest explanation and the simplest understanding of creation is right there in the words in front of us. If we have to go through mental gymnastics to explain how God spoke, and a day doesn't really mean a day, but it probably means billions of years for this to happen, we're missing the principle here. Occam's razor, we're going to use Occam's razor and some of this stuff today to kind of shave away some of the extraneous things that may be relevant as we talk about these principles, but are not driving the core underlying principle. So here's our first model. It's a simple line. It's a supply curve. If you notice on this line, it slopes upward and to the right. Okay, very, very basic. The idea being, on the horizontal axis, you have price. On the vertical axis, I'm a banker, I'm not an engineer, okay? Horizontal, vertical, I don't know. On the one that goes up and down, you have price. And on the one that goes that way, you have quantity. So if you're a seller or a provider or a supplier of a product or a service, and you can sell something for $5, whatever it is that you've made, you'll produce a certain amount of them. But if you can sell that same thing for $10, $20, $30, you're going to be more motivated to bring more of that good or service to the market to sell. So the supply curve has an upward slope to it. It goes from left to right and it slopes upward. The higher the price, the more as a supplier you're going to bring to the market. Pretty simple. We're shaving away all kinds of stuff to get to this basic supply curve. Every point on that line, it represents a different quantity, represents a different price. And kind of like what we talked about yesterday with utils, this looks, and you can graph stuff and make it look really, really precise in a lot of different ways. The reality is, for any particular good or service, one supplier may see, hey, at this particular value, at this particular price, I'm going to provide this many of my product. And another one may have a completely different take on it. They may say, well, it's really not worth it even at $5 or $20 or $80 a unit. Suppliers are going to be imputing their own value to their service. What do they think they need to get for their good or service that they're bringing to market? The demand curve is downward sloping from the left to the right, just the opposite of the supply curve. So if you're a supplier, you want to charge as much as you can for your product or services. If you're a buyer, if you're cheap like me, you want to pay as little as you possibly can for that good or service. So the demand curve has the opposite slope as the supply curve. The horizontal line again is the quantity demanded of a good or service. The vertical line is the price. So there's this. We're at cross purposes, the buyer and the seller. So how do we work together as buyers and sellers? We both have different purposes. The seller wants to sell his product for as much as he possibly can. You and I as buyers, generally speaking, we want to pay as little as we possibly can. So we do that. And I was thinking now would be a good time for an economics joke, but there's just no demand for it. So, sorry about that. So trade occurs when a buyer and a demander, when a buyer who is a demander of a good or service, and the supplier, who's the seller of that good or service, apply different values to the good or service. Now, why is that? The buyer is going to attribute a different value to a good or service than the seller, and that's when trade occurs. And that's where these lines intersect. So now, while it looks like the value that is applied to the good or service is equal to both the buyer and the seller, trade doesn't occur if the seller and the buyer have the same value imputed to a product. That would be like me saying, "Hey, John, I'll give you $10 if you give me $10. You'll take that deal? All right. I would, but I get bored of doing that. We can go back and forth, and at the end of the day, nothing happens. Now, John, I will, here's a nice pair of glasses. John, I don't know, this is probably not your style, but, what would happen is I would sell you a pair of glasses. I'd sell you this bottle of water. I'd sell you this laptop, whatever it is. I would have to find a price point that you are willing to give me what I want for it. And what is happening in that exchange is you're valuing that. We'll stick with my laptop. Actually, it's Bonnie's laptop, so I won't demand as much of a price for it because I had to borrow hers. No skin off my back. So I'll sell her laptop to you cheap, but it's worth less to me because what I want more than that laptop is I want your dollars. I want your money, right? And you want her laptop that I'm selling to you without her permission. I want your dollars more than I want her laptop. Now, so that's when trade occurs, when we apply different values to the same object, to the same thing. When there are changes in prices, there are changes in quantities supplied or quantities demanded. So if I'm a supplier and I know that a buyer is willing to pay a certain dollars, like we already touched on, I'll bring more of my product or more of my service to the market to be sold. And so what will happen is there'll be a movement along that supply curve, or a movement along the demand curve if there's a change in the price of the goods or services that are being supplied. So changes in prices result in movements along demand and supply curves. It's just a movement along that curve. For any price, there's a particular quantity of good supplied or demanded. And talk is cheap because supply exceeds demand. Simple, fundamental concept, economic concept. So what's going on here is there are shifts in this demand curve. So anything, we touched on it already. So anytime there's a change in price, it results in a movement along that demand curve or along that supply, do it right, along that demand curve or along that supply curve. In this particular case, there is a shift. There's a change in demand. There's a shift in that demand curve. What's happened in this graphical depiction? So what we're going to say is that due to the change in the interest level, or an attitude, or an idea, or a concept, there is now an increase in demand for something. Okay, so case in point. Last night, when I was talking to you, before my first lecture, there was a stack of David Bahnsen books out there on the table. That stack was there. Y'all could have picked them up. Y'all could have read them. Y'all could have bought them. But due to my holding up Dr. Bailey's copy of the book, by the way, did you get your book? Very good. Thank you. Thank you for the prop. As a result of my holding that copy up and saying, here it's available, all of a sudden, those 20 copies that were available, after the lecture, there was a change in the quantity demanded for those books. And I don't know if there are any left, but there weren't very many left last night. So the price hadn't changed. There wasn't a movement along the demand curve for the Bahnsen books. But what had changed from before the lecture to after the lecture was the demand for that book, because there was a change in attitude toward that book. So there was a shift in the demand curve. So what happened is the number of books that would have been sold at any price increased, because suddenly more people wanted that book. Full disclosure, I probably should have said this last night. I know this may end up being a question that shows up in the Q&A. I figured I would head it off. I will not mention Ryan Morris's name, but he asked me if I had read the David Bahnsen book. Full confession, I have not yet read it, okay? But I've heard good things about it, and we were able to get a really good deal on the book, so I did want to make it available and put it out to y'all. But I do have a copy of it myself, so I will be reading it. I just have not read it yet. Had to get that out there. All right. Changes in the supply and demand curve. So we already talked about the change in demand for the Bahnsen book. But one of the things that didn't change was I didn't have an additional supply to bring to the table. So I couldn't change the supply of those Bahnsen books. Last night, the quantity, the change in demand for that books was real from before to after the lecture. I had 20. We basically sold them out. I don't have more capacity, more supply. Normally what would happen in a market that is functioning is people would say, hey, these books are selling out, let's go get some more. And so there would be more quantity of those books that would be brought in and supplied to the market. So these are very simple graphical depictions of supply and demand and how they work. They're very basic, they're very fundamental. They take a lot of work. I mean, this is Occam's razor applied very generously. I mean, we're just lopping all kinds of stuff off. There are a lot of other factors. There are, generally speaking, the demand curve slopes downward and to the right. So the lower the price for a good, the higher the quantity demanded will be. Well, it doesn't always hold. Case in point, there's a phenomenon called a Geffen good. Years ago, we had, my parents, not sure where, I don't see Mr. Robbins here, my parents had a golden retriever. She was a great dog. Charity was her name. She got mixed up with the wrong kind of other dogs, and we ended up having a bunch of puppies that we really did not want to have. So the idea was, okay, we've got these puppies. We don't need to have 18 dogs. Let's put an ad in the paper, free puppies. Put an ad in the paper, week went by, not a single taker. They were beautiful puppies. They were golden retriever and Malamute mix. Beautiful, beautiful dogs. So my dad said, well, let's do this. Puppies, $20 a piece. They were gone in a week. How does that work on the demand curve? It's not supposed to work that way. Okay, Occam's razor. We're taking general principles and whittling it down to some simpler models that are easier to understand. All right. So this is a graphical indication of a price floor. Okay, so this is what happens when typically when governments intervene and set minimum prices for products or services. Okay. And the horizontal line that's kind of a green, sickly green color, that's a price floor. So where that line intersects the supply and demand curve shows you where, generally speaking, what's going to happen if there's a price floor that is put in place. The supply is going to be way over here on the right because the price at which something can be sold cannot go below that floor based on some edict out of Nashville or Washington or whatever it happens to be. Oops, got ahead of myself here, sorry. But the quantity demanded, because the price is elevated, is going to be over here on the left-hand side of our chart. And so what you're going to do is you're going to have a mismatch between the quantity of the good or service that's brought to market, that's trying to be sold, and the quantity of the good or service that is actually demanded by folks. And there's not going to be as many folks wanting to buy that good or service. So there's a mismatch. It's these price floors mess up the market. Prices are critical signals in how an economy operates. Prices say, hey, if the price of something is going up, it says, hey, this is a valuable thing. People are going after it. People want it. People demand it. And that will typically bring more suppliers to bring that good or service to the market to sell, because they say, hey, there's an opportunity for me to make some money here. If with that price floor in place, consumers, buyers, you and me, are saying, hey, whatever this product is, we'll say it's a technical term, it's a widget that everybody needs. Everybody needs a widget. And you can measure the satisfaction of your widgets with your utils. So if you have a really nice widget, it's worth a lot of utils. But in this case, you're not going to get enough utils for the price that you have to pay for this particular widget. And so there are more widgets being produced than the market really wants to buy, that you all as market participants want to buy. So there's a glut or an oversupply of the good on the market. If you've got a price ceiling or a price cap, obviously you could also have a price floor. All right. Drop that sickly green line down below the equilibrium point of the supply and demand curves. And now what have you got? Now you've got demand is way out on the far side of the chart, on the right-hand side of the chart. This is how much stuff people want to buy at this particular price because there's a cap. There's a ceiling on the price that can be charged for this good or service. So the price by the suppliers can't go above that. Well, the problem with that is our suppliers at the particular price are only willing to provide this much of the good or service. So now we have shortages. So the takeaway from this, just at a very high level with the supply and demand curve, prices are critical signals in the operation of how an economy works. When you put in price ceilings or price floors, it messes up all the signals, and people don't know how to react. Suppliers don't know how to react. Demanders, buyers don't know how to react. It really messes up the system. And this goes back to some of the conversations we had last night about the criticality of being free to impute value, free to have private ownership of the products and services that we bring to market, that we sell, that we buy, because we're the ones that are responsible for how we steward the goods, the gifts, the talents, the resources that God gives to us. We touched last night for just a few minutes on utility and marginal utility, that last Lego. My brother was here last night. He's an engineer. He's a nerd. He said, well, if you'd have just said in calculus, it means, I have no idea, some kind of derivative, something or other, blah, blah, blah. He said, that would have been the simple way to explain it. I said, Calvin, I thought I wanted to be an engineer until I realized you had to do high-level math. And then I said, I think business and accounting is the way for me to go. So I didn't get into that. So the law of diminishing marginal utility. I think this is fun stuff. So we talked about that marginal utility, that last Lego. There's also this idea of diminishing marginal utility. And this theory was formulated, came up by two different guys at about the same time. Actually, three guys. Carl Menger, William Jevons, they both came up with it independently in about 1871. Leon Walras in 1874. The principle is that the greater the consumption of the good, the smaller the increase in utility, that smaller number of utils of satisfaction you'll get with the next unit of consumption. And it says, basically, this law of diminishing marginal utility will continue, you'll continue to consume a good or service or a product, whatever's given you satisfaction, utility, until the cost of the next unit of consumption is equal to the benefit that you'll realize. So this is what my brother would love. Here is a graph of diminishing marginal utility. Does that explain it? Y'all see that there? You get it? Okay, we got a few nerds out there. I see a few heads nodding. I see a bunch of heads shaking. This is what I'm talking about when I said economics. They try to make it a science. It's a social science. It's touchy-feely. It's not hard science. But that makes it look like a hard science, doesn't it? Okay. Let's talk about a real example that I can relate to. So I live in Sparta. Sparta is the county seat of White County. Sparta is a metropolis at about 6,000 people. White County is home to Sparta. White County is the home to Quebec. My friends from Canada would normally say Quebec, but no. This is Quebec, Quebec. We also have the other larger town is Dole, D-O-Y-L-E, Dole. But our economic hub to the north is Cookeville. Cookeville is a behemoth. It's the home to Tennessee Tech. If you're in Tennessee and you want to get an education, you go to Tennessee Tech. If you want to have a good time, you go to the University of Tennessee. I can say that because my brother went to the University of Tennessee. But in Cookeville, we have Ralph's Donuts. Ralph's is an icon. If y'all ever come down to White County or Putnam County, we'll go to Ralph's. I'll take you there. Ralph's has great donuts. Their key lime donut is amazing. They have lots of donuts. So one of the early things when we moved down there about 2.5 years ago, we went to Ralph's Donuts to experience Ralph's Donuts. And we bought some donuts. And they were so good. They were good. And we ate some donuts. And we ate some more donuts. And we ate some more donuts. And we kept eating donuts. They were amazing. And then we realized that the cost of the next donut, not the dollars, the cost to our stomachs, of eating that next donut or taking that next bite was going to be equivalent or maybe even a little bit higher than the utility that we were going to receive from that donut. So we quit. So consumption or production, if you're a producer, will continue until marginal utility and marginal cost are equal, ceteris paribus, all else being equal. That's generally how things work. So then there's the concept of opportunity cost. The cost, what is opportunity cost? The cost of opportunity cost, is the cost of a good or service measured in terms of the foregone opportunity to pursue the next best possible alternative. So my wife had her choice of billions of men. She chose me. Worked out well for me, right? And by doing that, she gave up the opportunity to pick from somebody else. Now, there's no accounting for taste, but she did choose me, and I'm happy about that. And of course, opportunity cost is related to scarcity because we talked last night. There's, you can't be here and you can't be at the beach or you can't be at your job, whatever it happens to be. So decisions have very real ramifications. A decision is the death of a billion possibilities. How depressing is that? But it's true. It's true. Who knows what this means? There we go. So I'm guessing we've had some folks that have read Whatever Happened to Penny Candy. Or if you, there we go. All right, thank you, yes. Tannstaffel. It sounds like a good German word. Yeah, There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Keep that in mind, okay? There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And this plays out in a lot of different ways, but, everywhere is walking distance if you have the time. You got to make choices. You got to make decisions. We can enjoy the stroll, we can enjoy the walk, but better ways to go about it. Let's talk about David Ricardo. So he formulated the law of comparative advantage. This is another key principle, and all of these things really are girded by, as we talked about last night, the creation mandate and the ability to own private property. Opportunity cost, the law of comparative advantage, is the ability of an individual or economy to produce a good or service at a lower cost, opportunity cost, then it's trading partners, okay? So I'm an accountant, I'm a banker. I can do some home renovations, home repairs. I've finished a basement and done all this kind of work. When it comes to plumbing, I can figure it out. It takes me a while, but it's better for me to find somebody who is an expert plumber to come in and do whatever work needs to be done than it is for me to take my time away from my work as a banker and do the plumbing repairs. But let's make it real, okay? The folks in the Prairie of Prax and Whoville are clamoring for the latest fashion because everybody needs a thneed. And they also like music, so flubers. So we're going to talk about opportunity cost and comparative advantage in Whoville and the Prairie of Prax. And I just have to say, it is hard. It's hard to be taken seriously when you're talking about thneeds and flubers. But maybe, hopefully, this will be helpful to you. So you can see, do I have a pointer here? Uh-oh. That wasn't the right button. Okay, that works. Let's see. I've got a pointer. Look at that. I will try not to blind anybody. So, so here we go. We can see that the Prairie of Prax here is in this column, and their production of what they can produce if they put their resources together. And the Prairie of Prax can produce 750 flubers, we'll just say a week. Or they can produce 1,000 thneeds. That's hard to say. So, but the problem is they can't produce flubers and thneeds at the same time, right? You can only do one thing. There's an opportunity cost for them to produce one or the other. But over in Whoville, they can produce 2,000 flubers a week or 3,000 thneeds. And everybody needs a thneed, so we need to really get lots of thneeds out there. So flubers, if both Prairie of Prax and Whoville produced, they could produce 2,750 flubers. Or they could, between the two of them, they could produce 4,000 thneeds. But we've got demand for both thneeds and flubers. What are we going to do? How are we going to figure this out? How are we going to produce enough thneeds and flubers to make everybody happy? Well, we're going to have to engage in trade. Prairie of Prax, by the way, does anybody know what story the Prairie of Prax is in? All right, I got a few hands. Okay. It's the story of the Zacks. It's a fun story. All right. So they're going to have to get together. They're going to have to work. Whoville and the good folks of the Prairie of Prax are going to have to get together, and they're going to have to find the comparative advantage. Who has the comparative advantage? Let me go back real quick. In this particular case, Whoville has an absolute advantage. They can produce more thneeds and flubers than can the Prairie of Prax. There's more people. I mean, they've got Cindy Lou Who. They've got the Grinch now is on their side. So, you know, they can produce more stuff over there than a couple of stubborn Zacks who are stuck in their tracks on the Prairie of Prax. They can only produce 1,750. You know, they can't produce them both, but you know, so Prairie of Prax is just kind of, those Zacks are really in the way. They've got that bypass going over them. So it's really an obstruction to the production of stuff. So Whoville has an absolute advantage. But let me go back. But Prairie of Prax actually has a comparative advantage, and that if they produce flubers, they will give up 250 thneeds, or they will give up, sorry, let me rephrase that. They can produce, divide 2,000 by 3,000. Whoville can produce 33% more thneeds than flubers, and Prairie of Prax can produce 25% more thneeds than flu-flubers. So let's go back over here and see how we can best meet this. Again, so we touched on this. They both produce flu-flubers. We can produce 2,750. That leaves the demand for thneeds unmet. They can produce thneeds, and we can get 4,000 of them cranked out. But then there's not going to be any joyful noise and music and noise in any of the folks at Whoville or Prairie Prax. So what about this? So we divide and conquer. We say, okay, Whoville will produce 2,000 flu-flubers, and Prairie Prax will produce 1,000 thneeds, so therefore we get 2,000 flu-flubers out there and 1,000 thneeds. But the best outcome is if they work together, they trade, and we produce. Prairie Prax produces 750 flu-flubers. Whoville produces 3,000 thneeds, and together we get 3,750 units of production coming together to market by recognizing the comparative advantage that each country, each group has over the other in their relative ability to produce. So, silly example, but hopefully somewhat memorable. Made me look like an idiot trying to say thneeds and flu-flubers. But a very useful, very helpful concept. And I am going to call it quits, get us close to back on schedule. There is more to come, but you'll have to wait till later for the next installment. Thank you very much.